Professor of Law and Head of the Center for Trade and Investment Law under the Ministry of Commerce and Industry at the Indian Institute of Foreign Trade. Dr. Nedumpara has also worked with leading law firms and international organizations such as the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. He has appeared for various dispute consultation proceedings and the WTO proceedings as part of the Indian delegation. Dr. Nedumpara has received his PhD degree from National Law School of India University, Bangalore, and holds graduate degrees in law from the University of Cambridge, New York University School of Law, and the National University of Singapore. I welcome you, sir. I request you to please address our participants today.
Thank you. So my topic is actually on another crisis. So Sandeep spoke about national security exception, general security exception, how countries take measures which are trade restrictive, sometimes leading to trade remedy measures, and especially how the WTO can actually deal with the situation when there is no effective dispute settlement provision. I mean, the provision is there, but the appellate body, which Sandeep has rightly pointed out as the crown and the jewel, is actually in a very precarious situation. So we are really glaring into some kind of an uncertainty, and somebody who works on these kind of matters, I completely share with what Professor Sandeep mentioned in the presentation, that we are really looking into a very stark future. But at the same time, we are not living in the 1920s. So the kind of situation that actually led to the 1920 Great Depression and the kind of beggar thy neighbor policies which countries maintained at that time may not be very suitable for a 21st century world. Our world is absolutely interconnected and it is well integrated. So in that kind of a situation, how we can actually deal with crisis? See, the point is that all all international organizations, even sovereign countries, are actually ruled by individuals, and individuals will have their own preferences, their own likes and dislikes. So it is absolutely natural that all international organizations, all international bodies will run into some kind of a trouble during its life. But the kind of challenge which the WTO is facing at the moment is actually a life-threatening challenge. And that is a difficulty. So no one should take this issue in a light manner. We have to discuss the issue very seriously. And I hope that with the new administration within the United States, something will be done. That is again a hope, because there is another possibility that is in 2024, the same kind of protectionist elements can again come into the picture. So before time really runs out, we have to find a solution. So now I'm going to talk about, can WTO go plurilateral? That itself is a, is a very, I think, a dangerous question to ask, because we know that WTO has been perhaps the most successful multilateral agency, multilateral trade agency, dealing with a variety of agreements. And it has delivered so well. It has been administering the mechanism very effectively up until 2021. But in the future, there is a great possibility that negotiations may not be the way it was earlier envisaged. So when I talk about plurilateral negotiation, we know the meaning of the term plurilateral. It is actually a negotiation undertaken between a few countries or a few members, sometimes like-minded countries within the organization. So one of the major hallmark about a plurilateralist approach is that it is basically exclusionary. The beautiful thing about the WTO is that it is a multilateral body that envisages and encompasses partnership and engagement among all the countries, whether you're rich or poor, middle income or not so middle income. It is actually it is a body that can encompass all categories of countries and possibly all categories of regimes as well. So we have got sometimes, mostly we have got democracies within the WTO legal system. We also have dictatorships, totalitarian regimes working under the WTO system. And sometimes the WTO system, the participation within the system, has actually led to some of these economies reforming over a period of time. And specifically now we have got the China situation. One argument is that even after joining the WTO, China hasn't changed much, right? So this is some of the the inherent troubles, some of the inherent contradictions within the system. And within this discussion, there is now a focus on WTO going plurilateral. So that, most of you may be students in international law or international trade law. there is a very interesting or maybe a very important principle about WTO. It is actually called the single undertaking. So what is the meaning of the term single undertaking? Single undertaking basically says that nothing is agreed until everything has been agreed. So you can't have, if you, when you really look at multilateral trade negotiations, many countries have got certain kind of a comparative advantage in certain things. We know that Brazil and Australia may have a significant amount of advantage in agriculture production. Canada may have in dairy products, or European Union may have in technology and a lot of agriculture products. The United States may have a similar kind of interest. Japan may have an interest in technology related items. South Korea may have also a similar kind of an advantage. India has certain advantage in services related areas. But at the same time, it has got vulnerabilities in agriculture related areas. So in the context of multilateral trade negotiation, the principle of single undertaking is extremely important to ensure that no issue is basically sidelined. So when you come and participate in a negotiation, all issues get the requisite amount of attention, and that an agreement can be struck which is beneficial and good for the interest of all countries, irrespective of the size or trade preferences. In other words, the WTO membership actually represents a spectrum of issues. And that is why the single undertaking is a very important principle in the WTO. So now I have actually presented a picture that is actually a railway line in Delhi during the midst of November, December, in a foggy summer. You are actually in the middle of a traffic junction, or maybe you're facing a fork in the road. Should the WTO remain multilateral or should WTO remain plurilateral? Because most of the countries say that we actually want to do business. In the 25 years long history of WTO, only one agreement has actually been signed. I'm not talking about the annexes within the services agreement, but only one agreement on trade facilitation has been signed in the last 25 years, maybe 26 years now. There was an amendment to the TRIPS, basically with respect to making access to medicines. So that was actually a 2003 ministerial decision, a waiver. Then it became an amendment in 2017. It took a bit of time. But in the last 20 years, only one or two major agreements have been signed. The WTO treaty is actually looking the same, nearly the same as it was signed in 1994. So what is actually the right way to take the WTO forward? And we know that in the 21st century, a lot of new issues have basically come up. The issues basically deal with the digital issues, sometimes with new categories of pharmaceutical products. We know that fisheries is actually one of the major concerns again, because now one of the real issues in international trade is actually the sustainability of the planet. And I'm very glad to find that a number of such issues are actually included within the conference. Climate change convention. How can we reduce carbon emissions? How can there be binding obligations on that? So a large number of issues relating to the blue planet, or what you call as the blue economy, has arisen in recent times, especially with respect to sustainability and also with respect to digital trade. The point is that it is now most of the countries are absolutely aware of the commitments which the WTO agreements entail, and they will not, ignorantly or maybe innocently walk into a trade negotiation. So it is very difficult to have an agreement among all the WTO membership on some of the critical issues, and that is why some countries say that we cannot actually, the point is that we are willing to do something, and if we are willing to do, then we should be allowed to do that along with a group of like-minded countries. But some other countries actually say that when the WTO was entered into force in 1994, there were certain mandated negotiations. What actually happened to services? Services may be a very important sector for our economy. Agriculture may be a very important sector for our economy. What is actually happening to these areas? So unless there is momentum in all the areas, the approach of these countries is that new trade agreements should not be ushered in without having consensus. So recently, India and South Africa actually came out with a proposal. This proposal is actually with respect to preserving the consensus principle in WTO. So the principle of consensus is that everyone has to agree. If there are 164 member countries present in the room, even one country can actually veto a particular decision. So India's approach and India's and South African proposal is basically saying that, the plurilateral approach, so, or plurilateral, or sometimes people call it the club approach, cannot be taken without the consensus of the other WTO members. Some people were obviously very much disappointed with this response. They said that the multilateral trading system is gasping for the breath, and this plurilateral approach is something to save the system. But India and South Africa have actually thrown a wrench into the system. So that is the other side of the spectrum, because in all these debates, it is extremely important to understand both sides. Both sides have some arguments in their favor. So now let me actually talk about, I have put in the box. I hope some of you can actually see the PowerPoint. Article 2.2 of the Marrakesh Agreement, that is the agreement constituting the WTO, mentions this. The WTO shall provide the forum for negotiations among its members concerning multilateral trade relations in matters dealt with under the agreement. So the very objective is that the WTO shall provide a multilateral forum for most of these issues. So now we think about some of the plurilateral issues being discussed in the WTO right now, like electronic commerce, digital economy issues, MSME issues. So whether this issue, or maybe investment facilitation for that matter, should these issues be allowed to go ahead without the support of the entire WTO membership? India says that there are many provisions, inbuilt safeguards within the WTO agreement, which basically discourage the use of Article 19.1 of the Marrakesh Agreement says that the WTO shall continue. So when we think about the WTO, the two major bodies that actually take the decisions include the Ministerial Conference, and the Ministerial Conference only meets once in 2 years. And in the absence of the Ministerial Conference, the General Council of the WTO performs the functions. And these bodies will have to continue the GATT practice of decision making by consensus. The WTO also provides a mechanism for voting in certain situations. So with respect to maybe waiver, so Prof. I think is presenting a paper on introducing certain waiver with respect to IPR issues in the context of COVID vaccine or COVID related drugs for that matter. If the WTO Ministerial Conference has to take a decision, of course the decision has to be brought by consensus. But if consensus is not forthcoming, then it can be taken by a voting of 3/4 majority actually. So there is a mechanism for voting by 3/4 majority as well. But in the history of WTO, most of you know that all the decisions are actually taken by consensus. The situations in which voting has been resorted to may be very minimal. I don't even know that many instances where voting has actually been taken, recourse to by the WTO members. So there are two issues. One may basically with respect to amendment provision as well. Even with respect to amendment provision, the WTO agreement basically says that it has to be taken by consensus. This is Article 10 of the Marrakesh Agreement. And it also says that if consensus is not reached or arrived at, the Ministerial Conference shall decide by 2/3 majority of the members. So voting is basically permitted in two situations. One with respect to waiver, and the other thing with respect to amendment and certain other decisions as well. The first situation actually provides for a 3/4 majority. The second situation under Article 10 talks about a 2/3 majority. But hardly, to my knowledge, the voting approach has not been well accepted, at least in practice within the WTO legal system. So now when we think about plurilaterals, whether plurilateral agreements are actually a good fit within the system. So let me actually go back and try to explain the situation to you. The WTO agreement also says that the WTO shall provide common institutional framework for the conduct of trade relations among its members in matters related to agreements and associated legal instruments included in the annexes to the agreement. So there are 3 annexes to the agreement, which is basically Annex 1A. So Annex 1A is, most of you know, these are actually the most important covered agreement. All the GATT agreement, the agriculture agreement, the services agreement, the rules of origin agreement, the safeguards agreement, anti-dumping subsidies. All these agreements actually come within the Annex 1A. Then you have got Annex 1B and Annex 1C as well. In addition to that, there is a separate category called Annex 4 agreements. So there are only 4 Annex 4 agreements. One is actually the agreement on civil aircraft. The other is the agreement on government procurement. The third is International Dairy Agreement. And the fourth is International Bovine Meat Agreement. You have to remember that even among these 4 plurilateral agreements, which are specifically included within the WTO, 2 agreements have actually been terminated. So only 2 agreements, especially the the government procurement agreement is perhaps the most important agreement that is surviving at the moment. So, and the WTO provision also mentions it very clearly that plurilateral trade agreements do not create either obligations or right for members that have not accepted them. So in a way, if a few countries, maybe 10 or 15 countries, really want to have a plurilateral agreement, they can actually go ahead and do that. And the commitments undertaken as part of the plurilateral agreements will not be binding upon the remainder of the WTO membership. This position is absolutely clear. But there is one more important point, which I just want to highlight in the next slide. This is actually, again, part of Article 10 of the Marrakesh Agreement. It says, the ministerial conference, upon the request of the members, parties to a trade agreement, may decide exclusively by consensus. Let me again put some emphasis on the word, may decide exclusively by consensus to add that agreement to Annex 4. The ministerial conference, upon request of the members, parties to the plurilateral agreement may decide to delete that agreement from Annex 4. So again, if the WTO membership actually wants to have a new agreement, there's a special provision within the Marrakesh Agreement. They can add by exclusive consensus. And if they want to delete an agreement, they can also do it by an exclusive consensus. But the term that I want to put in inverted commas or in quotes is actually exclusively. So even with respect to plurilateral agreement, assuming that the WTO members actually want to have an agreement on digital economy issues, tomorrow they can do that, but not by an agreement among themselves. They will have to actually seek the consensus of the remainder of the WTO membership. So in a way, if you look at the structure of the WTO, any member that has certain amount of concerns in some of the more sensitive issues being included within the WTO has the option to veto it. And if the current joint initiative approaches go ahead, then the long-term systemic danger is that the WTO membership may actually lose the right of veto. And that is a very serious concern, in fact. So in the future, the WTO may completely, transform from a multilateral organization to a club-based organization in the future. It can actually become something very similar to an OECD, where a few countries may be part of some of the most innovative agreements, and the remainder of the countries may be signatories to the conventional or the traditional agreements for that matter. So now the 4 joint initiatives at the moment, which are being negotiated by some of the like-minded countries in the WTO, include investment facilitation. You know that investment facilitation may look like a very innocuous item. Just like providing a single electronic window clearance, a single window for receiving a permission on an application, etc. But sometimes it can be even more complicated. So Brazil had actually submitted a paper with respect to investment facilitation agreement, and that agreement even included an MFN provision, and some of the provision also resembled that of investment protection agreements. So India had a particular concern that at the moment this agreement may actually look like an investment facilitation agreement, but in the future it can transfigure into an investor protection agreement. The second most important item is domestic regulation in services. So for some of the people who may be having a bit of idea about the GATS, Article 6.4 of the GATT talks about a mandate, a multilaterally given mandate for continuing negotiation on developing disciplines with respect to qualification procedures, licensing procedures, and technical standards. And there was actually a working party on domestic regulations, which was established in 1999. This working party was basically entrusted with the responsibility of coming out with disciplines in their subject matter. But what happened later? Some of the countries completely abandoned the working party on domestic regulation, and they started a plurilateral gold joint initiative on domestic regulation. Now they say, we are actually going to extend the benefit to everyone on a non-discriminatory basis. So even if you do not join this agreement, don't worry about it. You will get whatever we are actually inscribing in your schedule. But the problem here is that this agreement is actually, it is an illegitimate initiative. Even if you're getting the fruits of an illegitimate, I think, initiative, at least based on principles, you should oppose it. And that is what India and South Africa have attempted to do in their proposal. So now I have got some systemic concerns. I mentioned about all these things. Since my time is running out, let me actually talk about something called open plurilateralism. So many people, including Bernard Hockman, Petros Mavroidis, they have spoken about something called an open plurilateralism. What is actually the meaning of the term open plurilateralism? It is based upon the notion that the participation in these agreements is actually purely optional or voluntary. There is no compulsion on any country to join it. And even if the limited number of countries who join this negotiation undertake any kind of commitments, they will be shared on a non-discriminatory basis to everyone. So that means you don't suffer anything, but you will get everything. One I think is, a clear example within the WTO legal system is the Information Technology Agreement. The Information Technology Agreement was actually signed in 1996. It is not a separate plurilateral agreement per se, because the outcome of the negotiation was actually undertaken through inscription in the schedule of concessions of the ITA participating country. So every country will actually get the benefit, but the problem here is that they don't have the voice. They don't have the voice in the decision making. Then the proponents of the open plurilateralism also mentioned that they will be applied on a non-discriminatory manner, and the countries who would like to join this kind of open plurilateral initiatives will be given all kinds of technical capacity in the future. We will definitely handhold you, but the real issue is that at the moment, that. Let me also say one anecdote, and after that I will end it. So India opposed in 2004 and in 2014, India actually opposed the ratification of the trade facilitation agreement, unless one provision within the Bali Ministerial Conference with respect to public food stocking policy was approved by the WTO. So India had some minimum support price programs for certain agriculture products, especially with respect to staple food, and India did not want these policies to be challenged with the WTO. So India wanted the peace clause to be installed. There was a very ambiguous peace clause as part of the Bali Ministerial Conference. India wanted that peace clause to be more clear and much more longer in time, in the sense that the peace clause should not have actually a sunset clause. India said that we will not actually ratify the trade facilitation agreement until a solution on public stockholding for food security purposes is agreed upon by the WTO membership. And because of the strong pressure that India exerted at that time, the WTO membership had to agree to that. So once we go for a plurilateral approach, the danger is that the voice countries like India and South Africa and Indonesia may have within the system will get eroded, may not be overnight, but slowly. And that is something for which we may have to pay a price for. But at the same time, I also agree that the world is changing. The 20th century WTO agreement cannot solve the 21st century issues. So we need also to be a bit more pragmatic, a bit more flexible in this area, but at no cost, we should actually sacrifice on a principle. Thank you.